The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and I knew it was trouble before I even opened it because nothing good ever comes in a certified letter from the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association. I'm Nathan Reeves, and I've lived in this subdivision in Asheville, North Carolina for 3 years now. I bought the house specifically because it had a wood-burning fireplace and enough property to store firewood. Coming from a family of loggers and forestry workers, I knew exactly how to handle and store wood properly. My grandfather taught me when I was 8 years old, and I'd been following those same methods ever since. The letter was surprisingly formal, printed on expensive cardstock with the HOA's seal embossed at the top. It informed me that I was in violation of Section 12.4 of the Community Bylaws regarding unsightly storage of materials, and that my firewood stack exceeded the permitted height of 4 feet. The fine was $250, payable within 30 days, or it would increase to $500. I walked out to my backyard and stared at my firewood stack. It was beautiful, actually. 6 feet tall, perfectly arranged in a Hals-Hausen style, which is a circular stacking method that promotes airflow and proper seasoning. The wood was neatly organized, stable, and positioned 20 feet from my house exactly as recommended by fire safety guidelines. I'd spent an entire weekend building it after I'd split and processed 3 cords of oak and hickory. The next morning, I drove to the county forestry office. I'd met the chief forester, Douglas Martinez, at a community event the previous year. He was a third-generation forester who took his work seriously and didn't suffer fools gladly. "Nathan, good to see you," Douglas said when I walked into his office. "What brings you by?" I handed him the letter. He read it slowly, his eyebrows rising higher with each sentence. 4 feet maximum. "That's ridiculous," he said. "Proper wood storage for seasoning requires adequate height for airflow. Your Hals-Hausen is textbook correct. I'd use it as an example in training." "Can you put that in writing?" I asked. Douglas pulled out his official letterhead and typed up a detailed explanation of proper firewood storage according to North Carolina forestry codes. He cited specific regulations, explained the science behind proper wood seasoning, and confirmed that my 6-foot stack was not only acceptable but recommended for the amount of wood I was storing. He included his credentials, his badge number, and his direct phone number. "The HOA doesn't supersede state forestry codes when it comes to fire safety," Douglas said, handing me the letter. "Improperly stored firewood is a fire hazard. Your method prevents rot, promotes seasoning, and follows every safety guideline we have. If they force you to restack it lower, you'll have to spread it out horizontally, which actually makes it more visible and takes up more yard space." I thanked him and drove home feeling confident. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for that Thursday evening, and I planned to present my case. The meeting was held in the community center, a bland beige building that smelled like old coffee and desperation. About 20 residents were scattered around the room, most of them looking bored or annoyed to be there. The board sat at a long table up front, and I recognized the president immediately. Brenda Hartford was 52 years old, had blonde hair that defied both gravity and nature, and wore enough jewelry to fund a small country. She'd been HOA president for 7 years, and treated the position like she was governing a nation rather than a subdivision of 200 homes. Her vice president, Karen Sullivan, sat beside her looking equally stern. Karen was the one who'd actually sent me the letter, according to the signature at the bottom. I should have known a Karen would be involved. "We'll now address new business," Brenda announced, her voice sharp and nasal. "Mr. Reeves, you're here regarding your violation notice." I stood up, holding Douglas's letter. Yes, I'm here to dispute the fine. My firewood storage meets all state forestry codes. I have documentation from the county forester. Karen leaned forward, her lips pressed into a thin line. The HOA bylaws are clear. 4-foot maximum height for any stored materials. But state forestry codes specifically recommend my storage method, I said, walking forward to hand them the letter. Forcing me to change it could actually create a fire hazard. Brenda barely glanced at the letter before sliding it aside. State codes don't override our community standards. We have aesthetic guidelines to maintain property values. My firewood is in my backyard, not visible from the street, I countered. I checked before I built the stack. It's visible from the Hendersons' second-story window, Karen said smugly. Mrs. Henderson filed the complaint. I turned to scan the room, looking for the Hendersons. An elderly couple in the back row suddenly became very interested in the floor. So I'm being fined because someone looked into my backyard from their second-story window, I asked, my voice rising slightly. That seems like a them problem, not a me problem. Mr. Reeves, your tone is unacceptable, Brenda snapped. The fine stands. You have 30 days to comply or face additional penalties. I want to formally appeal this decision, I said. According to your own bylaws, I have that right. Brenda's jaw tightened. Fine. Your appeal will be heard at next month's meeting. Until then, the fine remains in effect, and you need to reduce your stack height. I left the meeting furious. The situation was absurd. I was being penalized for following proper forestry practices because someone didn't like looking at firewood from their upstairs window. Over the next week, I did my research. I pulled up the HOA bylaws and read every single page. Section 12.4 did mention a 4-foot height restriction, but it was under a subsection about junk and debris storage. Firewood wasn't specifically mentioned anywhere in the bylaws. The language was vague and appeared to be intended for things like construction materials, old furniture, or actual junk. I also discovered that the bylaws required the HOA board to consider state and local regulations when enforcing rules. That gave me leverage. I contacted a lawyer, James Patterson, who specialized in HOA disputes. He had an office in downtown Asheville and came highly recommended. This is an interesting case, James said after reviewing my documents. The HOA is overreaching, but fighting it could cost more than the fine. I don't care about the money, I said. This is about principle. If they can do this to me over firewood, what's next? Fining people for vegetable gardens or bird feeders, James nodded slowly. You're right. HOAs need to be kept in check. Let me send them a letter outlining your position and the relevant forestry codes. Sometimes that's enough to make them back down. The lawyer's letter went out the following Monday. By Wednesday, I received another certified letter from the HOA. This one informed me that my fine had been increased to $500 for continued non-compliance and hostile attitude toward board members. I called James immediately. Can they do that? Technically, yes, if they consider the violation ongoing, he said. But the hostile attitude bit is subjective and probably won't hold up if we push back. I think they're trying to intimidate you. It's not working, I said. James laughed. Good. Let's prepare for your appeal hearing. I'll attend with you. The weeks leading up to the appeal were tense. Karen Sullivan drove by my house at least 3 times that I noticed, each time slowing down to stare at my backyard. I also started receiving anonymous notes in my mailbox, suggesting I should be a better neighbor and respect community standards. I mentioned this to James, who advised me to document everything and save all correspondence. The appeal hearing arrived on a cold February evening. I brought James, the forestry letter, printed photos of my firewood stack, and a binder full of research about proper wood storage methods. I'd also printed out relevant sections of North Carolina fire safety codes and testimonials from 3 other foresters I'd contacted online, who all confirmed my storage method was correct. The community center was more crowded this time. Word had apparently spread about the dispute, and people were curious. I recognized several neighbors, including the Hendersons, who still wouldn't make eye contact with me. Brenda called the meeting to order with her usual self-importance. Karen sat beside her along with the other 3 board members. Tom Chen, a retired accountant, Lisa Martinez, a real estate agent, and Robert Finch, who owned a car dealership. "We're here to consider Mr. Reeves' appeal of his violation fine," Brenda announced. "Mr. Reeves, you have 15 minutes to present your case." James stood first. "I'm James Patterson, representing Mr. Reeves. Before my client speaks, I want to note for the record that the increased fine for alleged hostile attitude appears retaliatory and may violate fair housing practices." Brenda's face flushed red. "We don't need threats, Mr. Patterson." "It's not a threat, it's a legal observation," James replied calmly. "Please continue." I presented my case methodically. I explained the Halls-Hawson method, showed photos of my stack, presented the forestry letter, and walked through the relevant state codes. I pointed out that the HOA bylaws didn't specifically address firewood and that the 4-foot restriction was meant for junk and debris, not properly stored wood. My storage method is safer, more efficient, and follows every professional recommendation, I concluded. I'm not trying to be difficult, I'm trying to be responsible. The room was silent for a moment. Then Mrs. Henderson stood up. "It's still ugly," she said loudly. "We moved here for a nice neighborhood, not to look at log piles." "Then maybe don't look into your neighbor's backyard from your 2nd-story window," someone called out from the back. A few people laughed. Brenda banged her gavel. "Order! Board members, do you have questions for Mr. Reeves?" Tom Chen raised his hand. "I actually think Mr. Reeves has a point. The bylaws are vague here. Maybe we need to revise them to be more specific." "We're not here to revise bylaws," Karen snapped. "We're here to enforce existing ones." Lisa Martinez spoke up. "But if the state forester says this is the correct method, shouldn't we defer to the expert?" Robert Finch shook his head. "If we start making exceptions, everyone will want one. We have rules for a reason." The board deliberated for 10 minutes while everyone waited. Finally, Brenda announced their decision. The board votes 3-2 to uphold the violation and fine. "Mr. Reeves, you have 2 weeks to reduce your firewood stack to compliant height or face additional penalties of $100 per day." The room erupted in angry murmurs. James leaned over to me. "We can take this to court, but I need to warn you it'll be expensive." "Do it," I said. Over the next few days, something unexpected happened. My story spread through the neighborhood. People I'd never spoken to stopped by to express support. It turned out that Brenda and Karen had been heavy-handed with a lot of residents over the years, and people were tired of it. A woman named Patricia Morrison, who lived 3 streets over, told me she'd been fined for planting roses that were the wrong shade of red. Another neighbor, David Chen, Tom's nephew, had been cited for having his trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup, even though he'd been at the hospital with his sick wife. "We should form a coalition," Patricia suggested. "There's strength in numbers." Within a week, we had 15 households willing to challenge the HOA's overreach. We called ourselves the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Coalition. James agreed to represent the group for a flat fee, which made the legal costs more manageable when split among multiple families. Meanwhile, the 2-week deadline came and went. I didn't touch my firewood stack. The $100 daily fines started accumulating on paper, but James filed an emergency motion in the Buncombe County Superior Court to halt the fines pending a full hearing. Judge Martha Reynolds granted a temporary injunction, which meant the fines were frozen until the case could be properly heard. The court date was set for 6 weeks out. Brenda was furious. At the next HOA meeting, which I attended with at least 20 other coalition members, she ranted for 10 minutes about disrespect and the breakdown of community standards. "If people can just ignore our rules and run to court, we'll have chaos," she declared, her voice shaking with anger. Tom Chen, who'd been looking increasingly uncomfortable, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should consider mediation. This is tearing the community apart." "Absolutely not," Karen interjected. "We don't negotiate with rule breakers." That comment didn't sit well with the crowd. Several people shouted objections. The meeting dissolved into arguments, with roughly half the room supporting the board and half supporting the coalition. I went home that night feeling exhausted. This had spiraled far beyond a simple disagreement about firewood. It had become a referendum on how the HOA operated and whether homeowners had any real say in their own properties. My girlfriend, Sarah, who'd been patient through all of this, made me dinner and listened as I vented. "You know you're right," she said. "But is it worth all this stress?" "It has to be," I replied. "Because if I back down, they'll just keep doing this to other people. Someone has to stand up to them." She squeezed my hand. "Then I'm with you, but please try not to let this consume your whole life." She was right, of course. I'd been obsessing over the case, losing sleep, and letting it affect my work. I was a software developer and worked from home, which meant I had flexibility, but I'd been distracted in meetings and missing deadlines. I resolved to compartmentalize better. The legal process would unfold at its own pace, and worrying wouldn't speed it up. The weeks before the court hearing were relatively quiet. The HOA stopped sending me letters, probably on advice from their lawyer. I continued working, spent quality time with Sarah, and tried to enjoy my life. Then, about a week before the hearing, something strange happened. David Chen came to my door looking nervous. "Nathan, I need to show you something," he said. "But you can't tell anyone I showed you." He handed me a folder full of financial documents. It took me a minute to understand what I was seeing, but when I did, my jaw dropped. The HOA's financial records showed significant discrepancies. Thousands of dollars in fines had been collected over the past 3 years, but only a fraction of that money appeared in the community maintenance budget. There were vague line items for administrative costs and special projects that didn't correspond to any actual work done in the neighborhood. "Where did you get these?" I asked. "My Uncle Tom gave them to me," David said. "He's been on the board for 2 years and only recently got access to the full financial records. He thinks Brenda and Karen have been embezzling." "This is serious," I said. "We need to take this to the authorities." "Tom wants to, but he's scared. He's worried about lawsuits and retaliation," David explained. "But he thought you should know, especially with the court case coming up." I called James immediately. He came to my house that evening and reviewed the documents carefully. "This is beyond my expertise," he admitted. "You need to report this to the police and probably the state attorney general's office. HOA embezzlement is a crime." That night, I barely slept. The firewood fine suddenly seemed trivial compared to potential large-scale theft from the entire community. The next morning, I went to the Asheville Police Department and filed a report. The detective who took my statement, Linda Morris, seemed interested but cautious. "HOA disputes can be complicated," she said. "But if there's actual theft, we'll investigate. Leave these copies with me, and we'll look into it." I also sent a detailed email to the North Carolina Attorney General's office, as James had suggested. I didn't know if anything would come of it, but at least I'd done my due diligence. The court hearing arrived on a Thursday morning. Judge Reynolds' courtroom was modern and intimidating, with high ceilings and dark wood paneling. James and I sat at one table, while the HOA's lawyer, a stern older man named Richard Blackwell, sat at the other with Brenda and Karen beside him. The hearing lasted 3 hours. James presented our case first, calling Douglas Martinez as an expert witness. Douglas testified about proper firewood storage, citing codes and regulations. He brought photos and diagrams, explaining why my 6-foot stack was not just acceptable but preferable to shorter stacks. Forcing Mr. Reeves to reduce his stack height would require him to spread the wood horizontally, which takes up more visual space and reduces airflow, Douglas testified. It's counterproductive to both aesthetics and safety. Richard cross-examined him, trying to poke holes in his testimony, but Douglas was unshakable. He'd been a forester for 30 years and knew his stuff cold. Next, James called me to the stand. I explained my background, my grandfather's teachings, and my careful planning before building the stack. I described checking sight lines from the street and positioning the wood well away from my house. "Did you intend to violate any rules?" James asked. "No, absolutely not," I said. I specifically researched both HOA bylaws and forestry codes before storing my firewood. I thought I was doing everything right. Richard's cross-examination was more aggressive with me. He tried to paint me as an arrogant rule breaker who thought he knew better than everyone else. "Isn't it true that you were told to reduce your stack height and refused?" he demanded. "I was told to violate state forestry codes," I replied calmly. "I refused to create a fire hazard on my property." "You just didn't want to follow the rules," Richard pressed. "I followed every relevant safety code and regulation," I said. "The HOA's bylaw is vague and doesn't specifically address firewood. I believe they are misapplying it." After my testimony, Richard called Brenda to the stand. She testified about the importance of maintaining community standards and property values. She claimed my firewood stack was an eyesore that multiple neighbors had complained about. "How many complaints did you receive?" James asked during cross-examination. "At least 3, Brenda said confidently. "You have those complaints in writing?" Brenda hesitated. "Mrs. Henderson's complaint was verbal. What about the other 2? "I don't recall if they were written or verbal." James pulled out a document. According to the HOA's own procedures, complaints must be submitted in writing to be officially considered. "Are you saying you enforced a violation based on verbal complaints?" Brenda's face turned red. "The complaint was valid regardless of format." "That's not what your own bylaws say," James replied. The hearing concluded with closing arguments from both sides. Richard argued that HOAs needed enforcement power to maintain communities. James argued that HOAs couldn't arbitrarily enforce vague rules that conflicted with state regulations. Judge Reynolds said she would issue a written decision within 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were agonizing. I tried to stay busy, but every day felt like an eternity. Sarah kept me sane, insisting we go hiking, visit friends, and do anything but sit around worrying. On a Tuesday afternoon, James called me. "The decision is in. We won." I almost dropped the phone. "Really?" Judge Reynolds ruled that the HOA bylaw is impermissibly vague regarding firewood storage and that state forestry codes take precedence on matters of fire safety. All fines are vacated, and the HOA is ordered to revise their bylaws to specifically address firewood storage in compliance with state regulations. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Thank you, James. Thank you so much." "There's more," he said. The judge also criticized the HOA board for what she called arbitrary and capricious enforcement, and suggested they review their overall governance practices. That last part felt like vindication. It wasn't just about my firewood anymore. It was about accountability. I shared the news with Sarah, who hugged me tightly. "I'm so proud of you," she said. "You stood up for what was right." I also called Patricia and the other coalition members. Everyone was thrilled. Some of them had their own pending disputes with the HOA that would now likely be resolved more favorably. But the story wasn't quite over yet. 2 days after the court decision, Detective Morris called me. "Mr. Reeves, I wanted to update you on our investigation. We've been looking into the HOA's finances, and we've found significant evidence of embezzlement. We're executing search warrants today." I watched from my living room window as 2 police cars pulled up to Brenda Hartford's house that afternoon. Officers went inside and emerged an hour later carrying boxes of documents and a computer. The same scene played out at Karen Sullivan's house. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By evening, everyone knew that Brenda and Karen had been arrested for embezzlement, fraud, and theft. The amounts involved were staggering. Over $80,000 stolen from HOA funds over 4 years. It turned out they'd been running a scheme where they'd issue excessive fines for minor or fabricated violations, pocket a portion of the fine money, and then inflate administrative expenses to cover the shortfall. They'd also been billing the HOA for services never performed and kickbacks from contractors. Tom Chen, who'd blown the whistle by giving David those documents, was interviewed by local news. He explained that he'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't had access to full financial records until recently. "When I finally saw everything, I was horrified," Tom said on camera. "These women were supposed to be serving the community, but they were stealing from their neighbors." The legal fallout was swift. Brenda and Karen were charged with multiple felonies. They both posted bail but were removed from the HOA board immediately. The entire board was dissolved, and a special election was scheduled to choose new leadership. I was asked to run for a board position, but I declined. I'd had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime. Tom Chen ran and won, along with 4 other reasonable, level-headed neighbors. Patricia Morrison became the new president. One of the new board's first actions was to formally apologize to everyone who'd been unfairly fined over the years. They also implemented new transparency measures, including public access to financial records and a clear appeal process for violations. My fine was officially vacated in writing, and I received a personal apology from the new board. They also revised the bylaws regarding storage, specifically allowing proper firewood storage up to 6 feet in height as long as it followed forestry guidelines. The criminal cases against Brenda and Karen moved through the system slowly. I was called to testify at a preliminary hearing about how I'd first gotten involved and how David had brought me the financial documents. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Amanda Chen, no relation to Tom, built a strong case. "These women abused their positions of trust," Amanda said in her opening statement. "They weaponized HOA rules to generate fine revenue that they then stole. They betrayed an entire community." The trial lasted 2 weeks. Dozens of neighbors testified about excessive fines, questionable violations, and the climate of fear Brenda and Karen had created. Forensic accountants walked through the financial records, showing exactly how money had been diverted and hidden. The defense tried to argue that the money had been used for community purposes, and that record-keeping had simply been poor. But the evidence was overwhelming. There were transfers to personal accounts, luxury purchases, and a paper trail that clearly showed intentional theft. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Brenda Hartford was sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution. Karen Sullivan got 3 years and similar restitution requirements. I attended the sentencing hearing with Sarah and several other neighbors. When the judge announced the sentences, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, vindication, but also sadness that things had gotten so bad. As we left the courthouse, Patricia Morrison stopped me. "None of this would have happened if you hadn't stood up about your firewood," she said. "You started something important." "I just didn't want to pay an unfair fine," I said. "It was never about the firewood," Patricia replied. "It was about accountability. You demanded it, and look what happened." She was right, in a way. If I just paid the initial $250 fine and restacked my wood, Brenda and Karen would still be stealing from the community. My stubbornness had accidentally exposed a much larger crime. Life in Pinewood Estates slowly returned to normal after that. The new HOA board was reasonable and focused on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement. They organized neighborhood events, improved common areas, and fostered a genuine sense of community. My firewood stack remained at 6 feet tall, perfectly legal and properly stored. Every time I looked at it, I thought about the crazy journey that simple pile of wood had taken me on. Douglas Martinez stopped by one afternoon to check on the wood and confirm it was seasoning properly. "You know, your stack is famous now," he said with a laugh. "I use your story in training sessions as an example of proper storage technique and standing up for correct forestry practices." "Happy to help," I said, "though I could have done without all the drama." "The best lessons usually come with drama," Douglas replied. Sarah and I got engaged that summer. We planned a simple wedding in the backyard of our house, the same house I'd almost been driven from by HOA overreach. About 50 people attended, including many of the neighbors who'd supported me during the dispute. Tom Chen gave a toast during the reception. "To Nathan and Sarah," he said, raising his glass. "Nathan taught us all that sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do. He stood up for principle when it would have been easier to back down. May we all have that kind of courage." Everyone cheered. I felt embarrassed by the attention, but also proud of what we'd accomplished together. The Hendersons, who'd filed the original complaint about my firewood, sold their house a few months later. I heard they moved to a condo where they wouldn't have to worry about what their neighbors were doing. I hoped they'd be happier there. Ironically, the new family that bought the Henderson house burned wood too. Jim and Rachel Foster had 3 kids and loved camping and outdoor activities. Jim came over to introduce himself and asked about my firewood storage method. "I've been stacking wood for 20 years, but I've never tried the Halls-Hawson style," he said. "Mind if I take some photos for reference?" "Not at all," I said. "Happy to help." We became good friends. Jim was an engineer, and we'd spend hours talking about efficiency, design, and the satisfaction of working with your hands. His kids would come over sometimes to watch me split wood, fascinated by the process. The following winter was cold, and I burned through most of my wood stack. It had seasoned perfectly, just as Douglas had predicted. The oak and hickory burned hot and clean, keeping our house warm through several nasty ice storms. As I restacked new wood that spring, several neighbors stopped by to watch and ask questions. My storage method had become something of a neighborhood curiosity. People wanted to know about proper seasoning times, how to identify good firewood, and whether they should install wood stoves in their own homes. I found myself becoming an unofficial neighborhood advisor on all things firewood related. It was amusing, considering how much trouble that same wood had caused me a year earlier. The news media had picked up the story during the trial, and I'd been interviewed by several outlets. The headline, "HOA leaders jailed after firewood dispute exposes embezzlement scheme," ran in newspapers across the state. I even got calls from national news shows, though I declined most interview requests. One article did interest me, though. A law professor from UNC Chapel Hill wrote an opinion piece about HOA reform and used my case as a prime example of why HOAs needed better oversight and accountability measures. Homeowners associations serve an important function, the professor wrote, but they must operate within reasonable bounds and defer to professional expertise when appropriate. The Pinewood Estates case shows both the dangers of unchecked HOA power and the importance of residents who are willing to challenge overreach. Several state legislators reached out to me after that article. They were considering new legislation to reform HOA governance in North Carolina. I attended a few meetings in Raleigh, sharing my experience and offering suggestions. The resulting bill, which passed the following year, required HOAs to maintain transparent financial records, establish clear violation procedures, and defer to state codes on matters of health and safety. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. I never imagined that storing firewood would lead to legislative reform, but life is strange sometimes. Sarah and I settled into married life. We adopted a dog, a German Shepherd mix named Ash. Yes, named after firewood Ash, who loved playing in the backyard near the wood stack. Ash would often lie in the sun beside the stacked wood, and I joked that he was guarding our legally protected firewood. Tom Chen remained on the HOA board and did an excellent job advocating for reasonable governance. He and I served together on a committee to revise the community bylaws, making them clearer and more specific. We wanted to prevent future disputes like mine. One provision we added explicitly allowed for sustainable living practices, including firewood storage, composting, rain barrels, and vegetable gardens, as long as they followed relevant codes and regulations. It felt good to turn my negative experience into positive change. Patricia Morrison proved to be an excellent HOA president. She focused on building community rather than enforcing rules. She organized seasonal gatherings, started a neighborhood watch program that was actually about looking out for each other rather than reporting violations, and generally made Pinewood Estates a nicer place to live. At one neighborhood barbecue, Patricia pulled me aside. "I've been thinking about your case a lot," she said. "What strikes me is how much damage two people can do when they are in positions of authority without oversight." "It's scary," I agreed. "If I just paid that initial fine, how much longer would it have gone on?" "Years, probably," Patricia said. "They'd gotten away with it for so long that they'd become bold. Your resistance exposed the whole rotten system." I thought about that conversation for days afterward. It reinforced my belief that standing up for yourself matters, even when it's difficult and the outcome is uncertain. You never know what larger issues might be lurking beneath the surface. Brenda Hartford and Karen Sullivan both served their prison sentences. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Brenda's husband divorced her, and that Karen lost her house to pay restitution. I didn't take pleasure in their misfortune, but I felt satisfied that justice had been served. The restitution money was returned to the HOA and used to fund long overdue improvements to the neighborhood. New playground equipment, repaved streets, and better lighting in common areas. It was nice to see stolen money put to legitimate community use. My relationship with Douglas Martinez continued. We'd meet for coffee occasionally to discuss forestry issues and local environmental concerns. He introduced me to other professionals in the field, and I found myself becoming more involved in conservation efforts around Asheville. I even took some evening classes in forestry management at a local community college. My grandfather would have been proud to see me deepening my knowledge of the craft he taught me as a child. The firewood stack that had caused so much trouble remained a fixture in my backyard, rebuilt each year according to the same principles. It became a symbol, not just of proper forestry practice, but of the importance of standing firm when you know you're right. Sarah would sometimes catch me staring at the wood stack, lost in thought. Thinking about the whole crazy story, she'd ask. Yeah, I'd admit. It's hard to believe it all started with stacked wood. It started with stacked wood, she'd correct me, but it was really about people choosing to do the right thing even when it was hard. She was right, as usual. The firewood was just the catalyst. The real story was about a community taking back control from corrupt leaders, about professional expertise being respected over arbitrary rules, and about the importance of questioning authority when it oversteps its bounds. Years later, I still live in that same house in Pinewood Estates. The neighborhood is thriving under competent, honest leadership. Property values have actually increased since the scandal, probably because word got out that the community had reformed and become a genuinely nice place to live. I continued to burn wood every winter, processing and stacking it with the same care my grandfather taught me. Each piece of split wood represented not just fuel for warmth, but a reminder of an important chapter in my life. Young families moving into the neighborhood would sometimes ask about the famous Firewood case. I'd tell them the story, always emphasizing the importance of knowing your rights and not being afraid to challenge unfair treatment. Some people thought I'd gotten lucky, that things could have turned out differently. Maybe they were right, but I believed that doing the right thing, following proper procedures, and standing firm on principle would usually lead to just outcomes, even if the path was difficult. The legacy of the case extended beyond Pinewood Estates. Other HOA reform efforts across North Carolina and other states cited my case as evidence for the need for change. I received letters from homeowners across the country who'd been inspired to challenge their own HOA disputes after hearing my story. One letter particularly moved me. It was from an elderly veteran in Florida who'd been fined for displaying an American flag in a manner the HOA deemed inappropriate. He'd read about my case, contacted a lawyer, and successfully fought the fine based on federal flag protection laws. "Your courage gave me courage," he wrote. "Thank you." Those letters reminded me why the fight had been worthwhile. It was never just about my firewood. It was about protecting homeowners' rights and ensuring that HOAs served communities rather than tyrannizing them. Looking back, I could trace an entire chain of positive changes that flowed from that initial certified letter about my firewood height. The letter led to my appeal, which led to involving a lawyer, which led to the court case, which led to exposing financial crimes, which led to arrests and convictions, which led to HOA reform both locally and statewide, which led to better protections for homeowners everywhere. One person standing up for what was right had created ripples that spread far beyond what I could have imagined. Douglas Martinez retired a few years after the case concluded. At his retirement party, he gave a speech that mentioned my firewood stack. "In 30 years of forestry work, I've written countless reports and citations," he said. But the most satisfying professional moment was writing that letter confirming Nathan Reeves' firewood storage was textbook correct. It proved that facts and expertise matter, even in the face of institutional resistance. The applause that followed his words felt like a closing chapter on the whole saga. My own professional life thrived in the years following the case. The confidence I'd gained from standing up to the HOA translated into my work. I took on more challenging projects, spoke up in meetings when I disagreed with decisions, and generally became more assertive in positive ways. Sarah and I talked about having kids. We loved the house and the neighborhood and could imagine raising a family there. It felt good to know we were in a community that valued fairness and accountability. On quiet winter evenings, sitting by the fire fueled by wood from my backyard stack, I'd think about everything that had happened. The stress, the uncertainty, the legal battles, the unexpected criminal investigation, and ultimately the positive changes that resulted. If I could go back in time and avoid the whole situation by stacking my wood differently, would I? The answer was no. The experience had taught me too much and led to too many good outcomes. It had strengthened my relationship with Sarah, helped me make new friends, contributed to legislative reform, and reminded me of lessons my grandfather had taught me about standing firm on principle. The firewood stack in my backyard was more than just fuel. It was a monument to the idea that ordinary people can make a difference when they refuse to accept injustice, even over something as seemingly trivial as how high you stack your wood. And that lesson, I believed, was worth sharing and remembering.